quick introductions. My name is Shale. This is Joel. This is Scale of Star Wars. As you can see on the display, now that we've finally gotten it working. So, this panel is all about what we see.
Turn the lights down, Joel.
Turn the lights down? Yeah, thank you. So this panel is all about what we see in Star Wars and the more extraordinary things that we see. There we go. The more extraordinary things that we see, and at its heart, Star Wars is science fantasy, so we're taking a look at the science part of it.
Now, our goal isn't to say, oh, well, physics says that couldn't happen. It happens on the screen. So how can we use the laws of physics to explain what we see and to explain the choices that people make? That said, in some things like some of the associated role-playing games and whatever, people have assigned actual numbers to things that we see, and sometimes they do it wrong. And so that will call them on. But we're not going to say, well, this couldn't happen, just that in some cases we might not be able to explain how it happens, the Force.
So sometimes when they assign real numbers to things, they don't get it wrong, they get it very wrong. And that's something we will certainly talk about, but we're always going to take what we know as true to be true. So we've got a quick rundown of our topics. We skipped the slide that says warning math content. So we're both nerds. Joel is way nerdier than I am by orders of magnitude. But we both have enough math and science background that we can do we can run the numbers and we can explain in real math terms what things really mean.
By background, I'm a physicist turned computer programmer. The reason that this doesn't qualify for continuing education credits is I never finished my PhD. Sorry.
So, we've got a quick rundown of topics. Quick question. I asked this last year, and everyone raised their hands. That was fantastic. Does everyone in here know what scientific notation means? Almost everybody, if not everybody? Perfect. That's what we like to see.
Yeah. For those who don't, if you see a 10 with an exponent, that's just the number of zeros you can stick on the end. Sometimes, because it's a whole lot easier to say times 10 to the 30 than to write out 30 zeros. And yeah, we're going to be dealing with numbers that way.
So, as you can see from the rundown of our topics, we're going to start off with the hyperspace collision. That's from episode 8, the hold-on maneuver. Then we'll move on to blasters, clumsy and random. Then we're going to be talking about the resistance bombers, also from episode 8, and why bombs fall in space.
Last year someone asked us about kyber crystals, and so I spent quite a bit of time focusing on that. But in the middle, he's got a thing on what happens if you shoot a star with a Death Star.
Because, what if?
So,
alrighty, so hyperspace collisions are not like dusting crops. They are, in fact, much, much more explosive. So a quick thing about what we're talking about with hyperspace. Hyperspace is an alternative dimension where the laws of physics work a little bit differently. Hyperspace meaning that the laws of proportion and distance are different in some previously undefined way. My computer's trying to update. I'm going to apologize profusely for my potato laptop. I bought it by accident, by accidentally clicking buy it now, not add to cart on Amazon. So hyperdrives manipulate hypermatter to propel ships into this extra-dimensional space by which they can take chartered routes through the galaxy and try to avoid big objects that create a lot of mass shadow and basically not collide and bounce into a star or bounce too close to a supernova, because that would end your trip real quick. No, that's correct. So I've got one of the slots up there. That for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction, but the effects of that reaction are going to be felt a lot more by something that is very small and not massive than by something very big. as the unfortunate passengers on that rebel transport found out. So a Star Destroyer comes in at them and kaboom, and the Star Destroyer's just, yeah, sucks to suck. So a more massive object is going to be able to impart more kinetic energy on a smaller object that doesn't have enough mass to overcome the inertia of a Star Destroyer.
So force equals mass times acceleration. The more massive, the less acceleration. Conversely, if you have something not very massive, the same amount of force accelerates it a lot.
So this is important to consider with regards to the hold-up maneuver. As we can see on the next slide, I think. So when a ship enters hyperspace, we see them accelerate really, really dramatically, as we see from Hera going and jumping into hyperspace through this docking bay. And when this happens, it's called pseudomotion. And there's a big outlet of something called Corno radiation, which is not a defined term. We don't know what it is. We don't know how it works. We just know that it's a byproduct of jumping into hyperspace. So that's an example of doing science fantasy well, where you say, there's this thing that is a byproduct of this other thing that we see that happens on screen. We're not going to define it. We're going to let the fans assume that, yep, that sounds reasonable, so we're just going to go with it. So when this happens, when pseudomotion happens, there's a range. There's a maximum distance in which a ship will travel before it enters hyperspace and stops interacting with real space. So for things like her jumping through the docking bay, she had to be really close for that to work. Otherwise, the burst of radiation and the burst of speed would miss the target. It wouldn't affect them. So now we're going to get into the meat and bits of the hold-up maneuver. So I love this shot. It is fantastic, and the sound design is very, very good. So the reason it works is mostly because of the ships involved. We have the Supremacy, which I've got on the right. It's a mega-class Star Dreadnought Supremacy. We're not compensating for anything. It's mega. So it is broader than the broadside of the broadest barn your mama ever sat around. It's 9 kilometers thick and 60 kilometers wide. It's really, really big. Conversely, we have the Radis, named after the admiral in Rogue One, which I love that name drop. It's about 3.5 kilometers long, and it's shaped like a bullet, which means that all of its impact is going to be concentrated on that tiny little point right at the front. And that's why it's going to be able to pierce a broad, flat object like the Supremacy. So when pseudomotion occurs, the mass of the Radis is imparted directly onto the mass of the Supremacy. And we can see in the video clip that it's not obliterating the Supremacy, because we know that there are characters who are still on it, and they're still going to do things. They have a whole another act of the movie that they have to get through. So it's not obliterated, but the real part about that is all of those resurgent class Star Destroyers behind it that are lighting up like Christmas trees. And the people on there are not having a good day. Because what's happening is, has anyone ever played with a Newton's cradle? You know, the balls that swing back and forth, and the one hits on the one end, the ones in the middle don't seem to move, and then the one on the opposite end goes click, clack, click, clack. That's exactly what's happening here, is that a lot of the mass that's being imparted to those smaller Star Destroyers is shrapnel from the Supremacy that's being spread out over a cone behind it. So it's really using the enemy ship as a weapon against the other enemy ships. This wouldn't work with a smaller ship like an X-Wing, or even something as large as a CR-90 Corvette or something of that size range. That wouldn't work because it's not big enough, it's not heavy enough, it's not going to have as much mass. So it's not. So those ships aren't going to be able to make it through. So we see a couple times people will like to argue, oh, well, why don't we just use an X-wing and hyperspace it into the Death Star? Because it won't actually make it through, because it's not heavy enough. It's not big enough.
Just impact on the surface.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So let's switch to slightly smaller weapons. Blasters are, and energy weapons of that sort are a very common trope in sci-fi, because nothing says sci-fi like launching beams of energy at people. But in Star Wars, we see them, and they're really cool. But let's ask ourselves, why use them? We have to assume that the people using them are not morons. They're using them instead of projectile weapons, like our modern-day firearms, because they must be better in some way. Now, since if we look at the accuracy of your average stormtrooper, obviously blasters are very inaccurate, unless you're a highly trained rebel.
Unless you're Captain Rex.
Maybe there's some other advantage. So I went into this thinking, well, hey, maybe they can just carry a whole lot of ammo, so nobody cares if you're inaccurate, and you can just keep shooting all day long. Now, for that, first we're going to discuss what blasters are. Don't worry, I'm not going to read that to you. That's just the Wikipedia article. Basically, they're not a laser. Rather, it takes a little bit of the Tabana gas, the stuff that they're pulling from Bespin, and turn it into a plasma and launch that downrange. Now, I don't know why it doesn't slow down, why it doesn't spread apart, that sort of thing. I mean, that gets a little hand-wavy. We can do things like, well, maybe if it's spinning and then its magnetic charge helps hold it together. But that's not really our focus here. But if we're going to figure out how much ammo you can carry, how much of this gas gets used, we need to figure out how much it both weighs. So to start with, let's look at how fast they are. Now, Adam Savage, you can see it this time tomorrow upstairs, did a little segment in Mythbusters where he took one scene and looked at how long the hallway was, and so how long it took a bullet to get from one end to the other, and ended up with about 130 miles an hour. Now, Red Ling, in the Wired article, did more films and many more scenes. And first of all, they discovered that the speed is actually more constant in angular velocity. So depending on how you're looking at it, they all seem to cross the screen at the same amount of time. Unfortunately, that leads to an actual speed, as you can see if you read that graph there, where a lot of them are pretty slow, but as slow as 15 meters a second, and some get faster. We're leaving off the Starship ones, which end up going a lot faster because, again, the spaces are bigger and it looks better on screen. But his average for most handheld blaster rounds was 35 meters per second, 78 miles an hour, a low-end fastball, which means this whole batting of blaster bolts out of the air with a lightsaber looks a lot more plausible. But now we've got a speed. Let's use the 35 meters per second because that is a little bit more rigorous. Now, in episode 4, they were using real firearms that were just dressed up. And since we know that the Stormtrooper rifle was a Sten gun firing a 9mm parabellum, blanks, we can figure out how much momentum that has. If they fired it and felt momentum, and we saw that on screen, we can assume that that's the momentum of a blaster ball, right? And thus nerddom was born. So unfortunately, there's no deep, nobody's really done a study on the actual recoil from a blank, but we can estimate it from people's description of felt recoil and that sort of stuff. A regular 9mm ends up with 2.9 Newton meters of momentum, and a blank ends up being, it's about a quarter of that for a high velocity round. This is lower, so 0.4 of a Newton meter. Since we know speed and momentum, the momentum is mass times velocity, so we can work out its mass, about 10 grams. For reference, so that means every shot is 10 grams of weight, which doesn't sound like a lot, but a NATO 556 round, M16 and M14 fire weighs about 12 grams. So these stormtroopers and anybody else is limited in ammunition to about carrying the same amount. So then we have to ask, so if you still have to carry this ammunition, and it weighs about as much, you have the same amount of shots as a modern day soldier, what's the big advantage? Well, stopping power. That hits pretty hard, right? Launch somebody in the next week when you shoot that. The same guy who came up with our speed calculation, Rebel Lane, later calculated from that scene. He said, oh, from this, we know how much a blaster bolt weighs. He came up with 4.5 kilos because it launches a guy back, 10 meters. But if it did that, Han Solo, who just shot it, just had his wrist broken in about 5 places and also got launched backward. Since that didn't happen, we have to assume that, first of all, that my momentum calculation is much more correct. And second of all, that that launching comes from something else. So we've got this really hot ball of plasma that just hit a guy in the chest. It explodes there like a small hand grenade, launching him back. So the reason that you use a blaster over anything else is because it hits like a truck.
So, resistance bombers. The resistance bombers in Episode 8 are probably the worst designed ship I've ever seen. They're awful. They're slow and they're plodding and they're strictly vertical craft. The interior's modeled after what we see in a B-17 Flying Fortress. Big, long fuselage, people can run around inside, and ball turret guns and all of that. And they have this long sort of bomb bay hanging off the bottom. It's a big target that says, "TIE fighter, shoot me here."
But it looks really cool.
Yeah. And there's probably a reason why it's shaped that way. So we can see from this image that the bombers are flying very, very low over the dreadnought. So there's got to be a reason for that too, because that puts them directly in line of fire for. It would put them directly in the line of fire for their point defense guns, but Poe went and cleared them off, so okay, we'll give them that. But it also means the TIE fighters don't have to go very far to get to them. And they're carrying some A-wing escorts, so that should be fine. But they're still plodding and slow. But there's got to be a reason why they were designed with this huge thing sticking off the bottom. And it's not just so that can happen to them. So this shot is actually kind of important because it shows us that there's gravity inside the bomber. That's important because of what gravity is going to do for us for this scene. Star Wars is a universe where artificial gravity is never really explained. We just assume that artificial gravity is on every ship that has power to its artificial gravity system. Now, I'll talk briefly about what gravity is. I'm sure that many of you are well aware, but I'm going to go over it just for a baseline comparison. So gravity is what happens when mass interacts with the fabric of space-time. A more massive object will bend space more, and it will cause other matter to become attracted to it. Kind of like if you put a weight a weight on the middle of a trampoline, it's going to bend that trampoline down, and so everything's going to roll towards that weight, except in 3 dimensions. So it's like a 3-dimensional grid that's all being sucked towards one point. So we have to assume that the bombers and ships and whatever else in Star Wars all has this in it, which means that they have to have some way of manipulating mass so that it creates artificial gravity within the confines of the ship. So, so for that reason, we have this happening. So the bombs are falling because they are under the influence of the gravity of the bomber. And they continue to fall because the bombers are flying low. They are inside the envelope of the artificial gravity of the Star Destroyer. So they are falling out at 1g of the bomber and continue to fall at 1g towards the Star Destroyer because the Star Destroyer's mass is pulling them towards it. Interesting side note, there's just this decorates their bombs. I caught that while I was researching the scene. I know it's really small on the screen up there, but can anyone read Arabish? I can. First one says hi Snoke, second one says Han says hi. Like you do. So, because the bombs...
And he says, I'm nerdier than he is.
So because the Star Destroyer unfortunately pulls bombs toward it, then the bomb will explode and we get a nice big pretty red explosion. So in a future panel we may talk about what on earth they're loading those bombs with to create that kind of energetic reaction.
Blaster bolts.
Just comes and attacks close together. And that'll be a topic for a future discussion.
But actually, if you want energy density, let's talk about kyber crystals. So last year, in the Q&A, one of the attendees asked me, after I calculated the continuous power output of a lightsaber, if I could use that to figure out how big the kyber crystals in the Death Star, the generated superlaser, are. Now, that gets tricky because the Death Star fires about a 1 second pulse, whereas a lightsaber is continuous. And then there's also size. Additionally, we know from Rebels how big the kyber crystals are because we saw them. But first, let's quickly revisit the power output of a lightsaber. Last year, I used the cutting of a steel door to estimate the continuous power output of a lightsaber at a megawatt. Now, we happened to recently get a nice scene of the interior of a lightsaber with the crystal visible. So that lets us know just about how big it is. The drawing, I can't even see that. I can't even see it on this, but there are, that little drawing there is a prop drawing with full specs. So I know exactly how big the lightsaber is. And then we can kind of look at it and figure out the crystal. So it's maybe about a third of the lightsaber, so it's at most 15 millimeters across, and then it's probably about twice that long, 30 millimeters, a volume of 5.3 cubic centimeters. So relatively small, and yet it outputs a megawatt of continuous power.
Everyone seen Rebels? Hopefully? Most of it. Watch it, it's really good.
So in part 2 of the Rebels episode, In the Name of the Rebellion, they come across this giant kyber crystal being shipped to the Death Star construction site. Estimating things from the people standing nearby, convenient to that, we end up with a volume of about 8 cubic meters, 1.5 billion times the volume of the 1 megawatt crystal in the lightsaber. And this is one of 8 that go on the Death Star to produce its beam. The Death Star's beam, the power output of a Death Star has been calculated from how much energy it takes to put a planet's mass into escape velocity. That's been known for decades. The math is not super easy, but it's not bad. Anyway, 2.4 times 10 to the 32nd joules. Watts. In that second, it puts out 620,000 times the power output of our sun in 1 second. So how does that, so now we know the power output of a Death Star, and we know the power output of a lightsaber, and we know the relative size of the crystals. So does that pan out? Let's scale a lightsaber crystal up to the size of the superlaser crystal. That ends up with a continuous power output of 12 terawatts, much, much less. But that's continuous power. The Death Star sits there and only fires the one giant planet-destroying blast. So maybe, so let's look at, if we put the recharge time in, So, yes, it stores that power over 24 hours because we are told with some of the backstory that that's how frequently the Death Star can fire its Superlaser at max power. So its effective power is 2,800 yalawatts, 230 trillion times the sustained equivalent power of if we scaled up a lightsaber crystal. If we go the other way, if you have a lightsaber that had that kind of power output, it would be 4.8 billion megatons. So obviously, there's something else going on here. Nobody pulls out a lightsaber and cuts a continent in half. They have to be entirely different. Or else, why bother making something as large as a Death Star? We could probably make a planet-destroying beam that sits on a frigate. At first I was thinking, well, maybe maybe turning it into a beam rather than a blast takes huge amounts of power. But no, that's silly, because someone sooner or later would just override the safety controls and again use our continent-destroying flashlight. Now, it could be that the output does not scale linearly with volume and mass, but rather that there's some kind of extra feedback. When you make a really giant crystal, it can store a lot more energy. There may be something to that, but that gets really speculative and way more hand-wavy than even we are comfortable with. I think my conclusion there is that the Death Star itself is required both for power and for stabilization. Stabilization because the crystal that we saw in Rebels never made it. They overloaded it and it blew up really big. These things absorb all energy from around them, which I'll get to in a little bit. And this one eventually exploded, possibly because there's no Death Star type controls on it. Additionally, if you're going to throw that kind of power, that power needs to be generated from somewhere. And the Death Star's main purpose, I think, is a giant reactor that keeps dumping energy into the kyber crystals until it can be released in that 1 second planet-destroying blast. But again, then there are the efficiencies that I talked about last.